Thank you. A very warm welcome back to our closing plenary of the day. I know you've had very intense, very rich discussions in all of your workshops. You're probably getting quite weary now, and soon you will be rewarded for all this hard work and effort with a networking reception. But we wanted to be a little bit more reflective before we end today, and to broaden out. We've talked a lot about the importance of bringing together actors and bringing together disciplines, that transdisciplinary approach to this issue, and looking at this whole concept within the wider context. And that's really what we want to do in this closing session. And this session is going to take the form of just an interview. I'm going to have a chat with our two guests. Let me introduce them to discuss reaching out planetary boundaries and humanities. Our Professor Dr. Kirsten Meyer, who is Professor for Practical Philosophy and Philosophy Education at Humboldt Universität here in Berlin, and Hanna Dölle, who is an art historian and co-founder of KUKO, the Curatorial Concepts Berlin. So as I say, I'm just going to have a chat with them and ask them a few questions by way of reflecting a little bit and broadening out before we close for today. And Kirsten, perhaps I could start with you. And you work as a philosopher on environmental ethics issues. Just to set this in the context, what do the humanities have to say about this whole concept of planetary boundaries? Nice, simple question to start.
Right, yeah. As you mentioned, I'm a philosopher who works on issues in environmental ethics. So I focus on the underlying ethical assumptions and normative judgments that lead to the formulation of these boundaries. And in this respect, a couple of questions arise that I'm dealing with. For example, why should we remain within the planetary boundaries? Why should we avoid environmental change? How should we thereby deal with risk and uncertainty? How safe is safe enough? How does the precautionary principle, how exactly does it tell us how does it contribute to answering this question? And are there other than truly catastrophic kinds of change that we have maybe a reason to avoid? And moreover, who's faced with this change? Who is responsible for it? And who has the moral responsibility to do something about it? And the last question, that is clearly a moral question that is far beyond just natural sciences, from my point of view.
And before we delve into some of that, why is it so important to answer those questions, to address these issues? If we are, we're talking here about the practical application of this concept, but why do we need to consider questions like this?
Right, yeah. I mean, maybe I can come back to Melissa Leach's talk from this morning, because she pointed out that sometimes policy and action in the name of sustainability can lead to exclusion and dispossession of rights. So if this is a danger, then we should focus on possible trade-offs, for example, between sustainability and intra-generational justice, global justice. And to spell these boundaries out more concretely with respect to these potential problems, I think it is important to take a closer view on these possible trade-offs. Moreover, there may be trade-offs between global and intergenerational justice, and this is again something that maybe should include a broader ethical view on the planetary boundaries concept.
Let's come back on some of those questions in a moment. But Hanna, your work, it's all about working with images. And when it comes to visualizing what we're talking about, the Anthropocene in particular, and in the context of this framework, how do the arts help us to visualize and to understand what it is we're talking about? Maybe, yeah. You've got a handheld microphone, should be by your side, and we have some images. There we are. And you can see them on the monitor in front of you.
Together with my curatorial collective, my colleagues Annika Tukowski and Katarina Pelongo, we curated the exhibition Longing for Landscape Photography in the Anthropocene. And as we see here, photography shows us the surface of the planet from a heightened and also distanced point of view. So we might see the human influence and activity and also destructive patterns of human activity very clearly in that photographs. And here we see, for example, a work by Olaf Otto Becker, and he is standing on a huge concrete dam, and in his back is a water reservoir, and with the energy that is gained there, one single aluminum plant, for example, is supplied. So we see a very beautiful landscape in the beginning, but then we have a closer look and have an ecosystem in front of us, a riverbed that's completely dried out, and we realize, oh, there's something a little bit rare. And suddenly this tipping point in the image, that was something that was really interesting for us. And then just a second image is by Lois Herchenbleigner, who deals with the Alp tourism and the mass tourism in Ötztal, in the glacier area there. And we have a bicycle race and artificial slopes and a cave where tourists can enter. So the whole exploitation of that normally calm mountain area and that romantic area can be seen in that photograph. And we can touch people from different backgrounds on an exhibition. I think that's interesting. They don't have to read a scientific paper. They can just see the images and get in touch with topics of the planetary boundaries.
Thank you. And how important is it that we do this? I mean, you put together this exhibition. Why did you do it? How do you think that these sorts of visualizations can contribute to us applying this concept in practice?
I think we are in a phase where it's all about mobilizing more parts of society to take the issues seriously. And I think that's where we can contribute in the first part of the whole transformation process. Just saying, hey, we make art exhibitions because this is a topic that is right at the center of our concern in society right now. And art is always taking up the zeitgeist, the atmosphere, the current opinion. And so we try to put this into the center of artistic and aesthetic debate.
Okay, thank you very much. And Kirsten, coming back to those questions that you posed, some of the issues that you've been looking at, and I really did want to come back to that very first one. From an ethical point of view, why should we remain within planetary boundaries? And are there indeed some ethical boundaries within planetary boundaries?
Right, I mean, the ethical boundaries within the planetary boundaries, that's just the perspective that I mentioned a minute ago. So we really have to face questions like who causes environmental change and who is it that's faced with it and who's responsible for doing something about it. And that is part of the 2015 update of the planetary boundaries concept, and I think we should really keep that in mind, that these are important questions that should not be neglected. And moreover, I think that from a point of view of the humanities, the underlying premise that every major environmental change should be avoided could be spelled out in more detail, and Hanna's work somehow contributes to spelling this out in showing us pictures, in including artists who spell out what it could mean to humanity that the planet is changed in the way it is, and also which other kinds of values are maybe connected to this kind of change. For example, the aesthetic values these photographers point at or have in mind. And then we could also encourage a discussion on these issues, and I think this discussion is also important within the discussions on the planetary boundaries concept. And Johan Rockström himself, he published a book with the photographer Matthias Klum, and within this book there's an interesting quote, and these two say that they make a case for a new way of thinking about prosperity, justice and happiness on a sustainable planet. And they believe, that's what's included in this book, this statement, that preserving nature's beauty is a universal value among all nations, among all cultures and religions. And then they say that no one wakes up in the morning with the intention of making Earth an uglier place. So I think maybe this has also motivated the setting of some of the boundaries. Maybe it is also something that motivates us in our attempt to preserve biodiversity, for example. And these are considerations that cannot be focused on with a scientific account.
I was going to say, you
alone,
cannot define natural beauty.
One has to include other sciences, but also the humanities. And for example, art is very important, especially with regard to the aesthetic value of nature. And I think we could broaden up the discussion on the kinds of change that we are faced with, and also the kinds of well-being that are threatened by major environmental changes. I mean, on the one hand, maybe even the survival of humanity is threatened, and that is the underlying core of the planetary boundaries concept. But maybe there are other kinds of changes that somehow threaten the well-being of certain people, maybe not even of humanity as a whole, but then it would be helpful to spell out in more detail what and in which sense we're being threatened by these changes.
And this brings us all to the communications issue, which dominated our discussions this morning, because the panel feeling very much, and we're talking about the general public, as well as talking about policymakers, business, civil society. This is do you have any way of gauging what impact your exhibition, the Longing for Landscape exhibition, had on people who saw it, how many people saw it, what sort of reactions, and what do you think it tells us about how what you're doing contributes to this broader communication on this? And to you, Kirsten, I wanted to ask, is there a danger that in communicating this, we talked about it a bit this morning, simplification versus scientific accuracy. But first, Hanna, do you know what impact it has in terms of helping to communicate?
Visitors told us that they really had these images in mind also months after or weeks after they had visited the show. So I think also what we see here in the exhibition space itself, there's a moment where we have the time and the mental resources to contemplate about something. And most of the time in our daily lives, we just rush through the internet, through newspapers. We see pictures all the time, pictures of catastrophes and so on. So the exhibition as a medium of education is very interesting, because we take time to contemplate and might also be interested in things we would normally not be reading a lot about, for example. And especially if we have a topic like planetary boundaries that communicates itself over tables and charts, we might include, or it would be good to include also art as one part. We already said we should not mix science with other parts of disciplines, but yeah, it would be very helpful to include museums as also a space where we can still think freely. And artists also still have a credibility. They are not driven by agendas, for example. And there's a very interesting artwork has been shown in 2015 in Paris, Place du Panthéon. Olafur Eliasson, an artist from Denmark, he worked together with a geologist, and they brought old land ice from Greenland to the Place du Panthéon, arranged it in the shape of a clock, so people could walk in between the rocks, touch the melting ice, and that was really that sensory experience, and they could learn about the climate change in a very special way through a bodily and sensory experience. And also, what is a little bit paradox, by touching the ice themselves, they were accelerating the process of melting, which is something that's really a metaphor for all of us. We all contribute to the climate change ourselves.
And I'm just thinking, we talked, and we will talk tomorrow about education. Art can really help when it comes to communicating and educating young people about these. I mean, you're talking about touching, that's something with young children, a way of showing them.
Exactly.
How important do you think that could be?
And that's very important. We already talked about it in the workshop, and art was not a big issue there. But people, I think through these spaces in which we can still think freely and meet people that don't have a political, economical agenda, we have the possibility to believe in what they tell us. And just by experiencing an artwork like that, we learn within seconds, and we don't have to read and think that much. I think it can be...
The old adage, every picture spells 1,000 words, is very true. But Kirsten, there is a dilemma here. Because on the one hand, we want to communicate, and we want to communicate simply. That was a point that was made by the minister right at the beginning of the day. But for the legitimacy of the concept and to address some of the questions that you've been raising, the scientific justification is very important. How do you see, and how does your work help us to answer that question about oversimplification versus necessary simplification, if you like.
Right, yeah. I mean, I agree that an integral part of its purpose, the purpose of the planetary boundary concept, lies in the appeal to non-scientific policymakers, and that is surely an advantage of this concept. And as you say, that there is a trade-off between scientific accuracy and public appeal, and there's also a trade-off between taking all the other disciplines into consideration and spelling it out in more detail and selling this maybe to a wider public. So I think that the first step would be just to be aware maybe of this possible trade-off, and then also see the possible dangers of an oversimplification, but also the possible value of putting the things easier than one maybe could do it or should do it from a science perspective.
So that doesn't present you with a big ethical dilemma?
Well, I would say that we should keep in mind that the concept presents a simplification in some ways, and from my point of view, maybe the most important thing to keep in mind is that the concept does have a normative core that is in some respects of now underexplored. And this is especially important when it comes to possible trade-offs, as I said before, between possibly questions of global justice and intergenerational justice. And I would also encourage the scientists to spell out their underlying values in more detail, and not or boil it down to maybe the extinction of humanity, because from my point of view, there is more to it than just that. I mean, that is the worst, possibly worst result, and I also think that the precautionary principle in a way tells us to avoid this result, but still also the precautionary principle is something that could be spelled out in more detail, and I think it would be fruitful to do so. For example, one could mention that the precautionary principle focuses on the possibly worst result, and it tells us to avoid it in any case, but there are certain alternatives. I mean, for example, an expected value approach, and one has to spell out the reasons that speak in favor of a precautionary principle and against an expected value approach. And I think these underlying reasons that speak in favor of the precautionary principle and against just maximizing expected value are, again, reasons of intergenerational justice and also in some respects of global justice. So reasons of justice come into play again, and I think it would be fruitful to spell this out.
Hanna, I saw you nodding vigorously there. You would echo that importance of these underlying values being,
yeah, I think, it makes it more, it's again about the question of credibility. Maybe it's more credible if we just not boil it down, but also make clear that it's, that's also a question of aesthetics, like Kirsten said, or, of the underlying values and interests.
Okay. Just before we close, I just wanted to get a sense from you of where you think we go from here, particularly in relation to your disciplines. Because we're talking a lot about the concrete agenda. We've been trying to collect ideas, concrete suggestions for the way forward. How do you see your own work in this area for the future? Are you thinking, Hanna, for example, of any new ways of doing this, any new ways of bringing together the art on this, or what do you see as the future, and how important do you think your work will be in taking this concept forward and really concretizing and, using the word I've struggled with all day, operationalizing the concept? Hanna and then Kirsten.
I think the Anthropocene and the planetary boundaries is just a topic that's in the air. We all feel that something has to be changed, and so artists will work with that, and we as curators will also work with that. So it is important maybe not to invent new forms, also be creative, but also use the resources we have, the museums we have, go there for education and book tours, and just use the spaces we already have for culture.
Just to follow up on that before I come to you, Kirsten, we're talking tomorrow about alliances. We've talked a lot about holding hands, was one of the expressions used today, that we need to do this together. Do you think at the moment there is enough communication between the scientific world and the world of museums and so on to really explore and exploit these opportunities?
I think there's a lot of work that is interdisciplinary already within the arts, but maybe it's more the artists becoming interested in scientific patterns, scientific methods, and yeah, take from that part more than the science coming towards the art. And that's, yeah, it's just, it should be a process that's coming from both sides.
So you've gone towards them. Perhaps they could come a little bit more.
Maybe a little bit in that direction, yeah.
Thank you very much. Kirsten, for you, and where will your work in this area take you in the future?
Well, I'll try to put my effort in strengthening interdisciplinary forms of cooperation. I mean, one issue is the public policy side and arts and ways to somehow communicate the concept of planetary boundaries. But the other side is how can we set up contexts for strengthens interdisciplinary cooperation. So I think the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities should work together on these concepts to spell out the combining and also the differentiating ideas on them. So I think this is just a very important step on the scientific agenda, just to still strengthen institutions that provide the opportunities also for young research to really do interdisciplinary work on these issues.
And I just, similar to my question there to Hanna, in terms of any barriers to that, what do you think is the most difficult thing when you're trying to get disciplines that may not have worked together that much in the past to do so? Kirsten, what do you think is the most important challenge we face to make that transdisciplinary approach really work?
Well, it needs a lot of time, and it needs institutions that allow this form of cooperation. For example, it must be possible for a student to do interdisciplinary work within their studies, but also in their PhD. It must be possible to approach an academic career if you base your work on different disciplines. So we really need the institutions that enable this kind of work and that allow young research to step out of their discipline and to work together with others. It should be an asset for their career and not something that should rather be avoided in order to be a successful scientist or someone who is successful in humanities. At the moment it is more like that, where we need more institutions that facilitate this kind of interdisciplinary research.
Because without the structures,
that's right,
it won't. So you've talked about the reaching out, but I mean, similarly for you, Hanna, if you don't have the structures to foster that dialogue and cooperation, it won't happen. Any ideas for making it happen in the future?
Yeah, space is still a very important point, because in our world that's driven by efficiency and yeah, economic values, it's very hard to find these spaces, these buffer zones where we can discuss and think freely. And I think that's, yeah, important, the time and the space to bring the disciplines together. And yeah, we should all work together to maintain those spaces.
Thank you. Kirsten, you focus very much on the young researcher. Have you given up on the oldies, or is there a way also to encourage and provide mechanisms for older researchers to work together?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, what they need is the time and the structures as well. And then there are also a lot of opportunities for researchers like me, but we also need the structures in a way, and maybe the Excellence, German Excellence Initiative, for example, could build up structures. This money could be used to facilitate this kind of dialogue among the more experienced researchers as well. So that's at least something I would put my hope on.
Well, thank you very much. We're talking about reaching out. You both came here, you have reached out and shared your messages. Thank you for showing us those wonderful images. Thank you to you both, and we look forward to continuing these transdisciplinary conversations in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking Hanna and Kirsten very much? You may go back to the comfy seats. Thank you. So, thank you so much to both of you. And if you have any questions for Hanna or for Kirsten, I'm sure they'll be around this evening. You can grab them over a glass of wine. But I don't want to keep you from your glasses of wine. And nor do I want to attempt, ladies and gentlemen, to sum up today. You've heard everything I've heard, and it has been such a rich day. We will tomorrow, as part of tomorrow morning's plenary, hear some summaries of what you discussed in your workshop sections, and we will focus on that later on. So we have had people trying to capture the essence of those discussions. I think just for me, what has come out today as we focused really on that stock taking, where did we come from, where are we now, is just how urgent it is to act on this issue. We have begun to identify some of those key challenges that we face, but there has also been an emphasis on the opportunities, and that is something we would very much like to continue to explore tomorrow. So we will talk about where do we go from here, how do we mainstream this concept more. We will come back to this communications issue. We will come back to the education issue. And crucially, going back to our holding hands, that phrase Johan Rockström used this morning, we will talk about how to build those global alliances. If we are to do all this, if we are to speed up, because I think that's the thing I have heard most today, we're on the right track, but it's taking too long and we don't have that time. How are we going to do it? So we're going to focus on all of those things tomorrow. We start at 9 o'clock sharp, so I look forward, even if you go out to sample the delights of Berlin and the famous German beers, I look forward, but indeed in a moment, we'll have a networking reception here. I look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. One housekeeping note, please. If you have an interpretation headset still, either on your lap, under your chair, could you please take it back and hand it in as you leave? The networking reception will be outside. It's already up and served. So I just want to re-thank all our speakers today. Thank you to the moderators and speakers also in the workshop sessions. We look forward to hearing how you got on. Enjoy your evening, and I will see you tomorrow morning, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Thank you very much. And welcome back to day 2 of this international conference on making the planetary boundaries concept work, as we continue to explore the practical implications for society, for the economy, and for politics. One housekeeping note before we start. We found last night a key. It's on a little sort of triangular, loopy key ring with nothing on the end, a silver key. If anybody has lost it, I will pop it here and come and get it from me when we start the coffee break. So for those of you, and there are a few I think who weren't here yesterday, my name is Jackie Davis. I will have the privilege of moderating our discussions this morning. The housekeeping notes, first of all. Again, we have live web streaming on the German Environment Foundation website and then on YouTube, and already day 1 has been uploaded on to YouTube, so you can already watch yesterday if you want to remind yourself of some of the elements of that discussion. Should you feel moved to tweet what you are hearing today, a reminder of the Twitter hashtag PBConf17. But please do keep your mobile phones on silent to avoid disturbing the conversations. Yesterday, we focused very much on stock taking, on our progress since the concept was first launched in 2009. We heard some examples of how it is being operationalized. And by the way, I was having a conversation yesterday evening with people as to why I struggle so much with the word operationalization. And I've decided it's because the reason you find it easy, many of you are Germans, is because you're very used to making very, very big, long words and putting things together. We Brits tend to have shorter ones. So, but somebody said to me my other version of this, which is to translate and apply the concept, works equally well. So I'm probably going to try and stick with that for today. We considered some of the lessons we've learned from those initiatives, from the progress that has been made, and we began to identify the challenges ahead. But the core message for me, I think, from yesterday was just how urgent this is. It is now that it has to happen, Johan Rockström said, and that staggering number. He said, in 50 years, we have changed the conditions of 10,000 years. And in the next 50 years, we will determine what happens for the next 10,000 years. And now is that crucial moment. So today, we want to focus very much on where we are going from here. We want to look at opportunities for mainstreaming this concept, to accelerate the spread and the take-up of this idea, to its framing of our approaches to transforming our societies. We want to talk crucially later on about how to build those alliances, how to ensure, when I asked yesterday for key priorities, Johan Rockström's was holding hands, doing it together. How do we build that alliance, those coalitions, not just between policymakers around the world, but with the private sector, with civil society, with the media? What do we need to do if we are to become the stewards of our planet and make sure we take the right decisions now and in the right way? That is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to have a series of fairly short presentations in this session on opportunities for mainstreaming. And speakers, again, as yesterday, I apologize for being so tough on the timing, but we have a very packed agenda, lots to get through. After this set of speakers, if there is time, I hope we will be able to have a few questions before we move to the coffee break. But then if not, we have a panel discussion afterwards, and you can raise any points then. But it is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Heinrich Bottermann, who is General Secretary of the German Federal Environmental Foundation, to talk about introducing planetary boundaries in the economy and society. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, dear distinguished guests, dear colleagues, in all boundaries, there's something positive. This is a way it was once expressed by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. For him, boundaries were something that enclose a space. And this is exactly the understanding that I have when I consider the concept of the planetary boundaries. Some 200 years ago, Immanuel Kant surely had no idea what we would have done by now to the planet Earth. He certainly had no notion that today we would need to orient our lives to planetary boundaries. Boundaries which soon must provide 10 billion humans with a home, as already mentioned in various presentations and discussions yesterday. Here I wish to express my thanks to those who made presentations yesterday. Thank you very much, and many thanks as well for the discussions in the workshop. It was very interesting. I was there in these groups. The concept, ladies and gentlemen, has initiated a range of new scientific ideas and debates. It names the principal boundaries of our planet and shows where there is a need for action. In my experience, there's barely no awareness in the public at large for the ideas of the planetary boundaries concept, or in spite of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is therefore an important task to explain and communicate the scientific concept of planetary boundaries to various social groups in an understandable way. The Earth systems are complex. So this is no easy task. But let's not make the mistake to make the complexity too simple. Let's make it understandable. It means, if we wish to transfer the concept to the economy and society, the communications aspects is of the utmost point. Talking about communication, we have to know our target groups and to look at the world out of their perspective. To do so, we have to spend big effort on empathy. And we must leave our communication bubbles and also lead unpleasant discussions, especially when it comes to questions of social equality. For instance, concerning people with low incomes. Because in the context of political decisions, their voices are seldom heard. This contributes to the fact that trust in government and political sphere, but also trust in scientific findings, continue to fall. We need only think about climate change ignorance, which is connected to nationalist thinking and the desire for isolation. But global and complex challenges demand global and well-directed solutions. From a scientific perspective, the political sphere must act on the basis of evidence much more strongly than it has up to now. Unfortunately, we are forced to conclude that the things are going in the opposite direction. Take a look around the world. Facts are randomly distorted. Alternative facts carry more weight than confirmed findings. But parts of the finance sector cannot afford the luxury of alternative facts. Major insurance companies, as Munich Re, calculate the risk of climate change into their charges. Their business model would not function if they were to negate scientific findings. They must deal practically with facts and very likely scenarios. The World Bank, too, clearly names the risk in the face of climate change. It warns that through the effect of climate change, 100 million more people could be driven into poverty in the next 15 years. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my opinion that social justice, both perceived and real, must be placed in the center of all strategies. It is about enabling a life with dignity for all people without destroying the world and the planet. Exactly, this lack of level playing field is a challenge we have to master, worldwide, but also within the developed countries. The same is true of the increasing fear of loss in the middle class, whether real or only perceived. These things provide the breeding grounds of extremism and populism. You know it. We read it every day in the newspaper. What we need, ladies and gentlemen, is a new age of enlightenment. We need a renaissance of reasons. For it appears that, around the world, reason and rational thinking are in retreat. I see it as a task for all of us to respond positively to this trend with facts and with perspectives and solutions. And the concept of planetary boundaries meets this need in an outstanding manner. Talking about mainstreaming the concept, what could be the guiding motive for workable and pragmatic ways of implementation? Reconnecting to the biosphere and link it to the business models and lifestyle questions. Growth within limits is a key phrase, but also free development within planetary boundaries. But as we all know, there's always a gap between knowledge and action. Also, we have scientific evidence and, in principle, even the insight that something must happen. Personal and institutional action shows not reflect this knowledge. Example. Public institutions in Germany continue to construct new buildings. I think any countries in the world. But also without taking into account the best ecological standards. Case in point, the passive house standard has long been state-of-the-art technology. But how many building projects do you know in which it is really used? I think sometimes we lead a double life. On the one hand, we have a desire to save basic natural resources. And on the other hand, we lead the typical raw material intensive lifestyle of a rich society. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The interaction of environmental and social issues is currently seen so far often as an area of tension. In fact, they are bound together and must be thought as a unit. I consider exactly to this crucial to carrying the necessary transformation to a broad public. Because the subject of sustainable development still seems to be an elite project. To change this, ladies and gentlemen, the state must fulfill its exemplary role much more effectively. But it must also use its creative power. And I also believe that in this area, many people expect action from the government. For that reason, I consider it appropriate that the state should play an organization role and give orientation. A dialogue between leading figures from business, government, science, and society can also help to carve out the opportunities in sustainable development. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the problem is often that companies and corporations perceive their responsibilities for sustainable development as more of a burden. Too often, they look only at the short term and think in quarters, instead of taking a long-term perspective. Much too often, we focus on limitations, on problems and difficulties. But it is only positive messages and realistic goals which motivate us and get us closer to our objectives. It is possible to offer companies good economic perspectives and develop them at the same time towards sustainability by long-term thinking. What we need are examples of business models, products, and processes which demonstrate exactly that. The German Federal Foundation, the DBU, you know them, wishes to pave the way with practical examples to foster the necessary transformation. To make this in a credible and authentic way, we have started with ourselves. We have started to transform our institution. Our new approach is an ethic-based development of our way to work and act. In a bottom-up process, it was defined our philosophy to save the nature and the environment for their own sake. Last year, ladies and gentlemen, we instituted new inter- and transdisciplinary guidelines for support. They are based on the Sustainable Development Goals as well as on the planetary boundaries, especially on the already endangered and exceeded ones. In this sense, I see our guidelines for support as a possible approach to put into practice the planetary boundaries concept. However, our means and options are limited. Therefore, with our project support, we can address only some aspects and issues. A major target group for our support are small and medium-sized enterprise, the SMEs. SMEs can contribute in many ways to environmental relief with innovative products and improved production processes. When we make it possible for companies to contribute to sustainable development, it creates feedbacks also in the private sector, but also in other areas of the society. Then, the central message of planetary boundaries can truly become reality. The DBU provides another specific contribution with the DBU National Heritage, the DBU Naturerbe. The DBU is getting responsibility for around 70,000 hectares of former military training grounds, where training for war once took place, where tanks rolled and bombs were dropped. Valuable natural areas are now emerging. I think that this development has enormous symbolic power. When a location with a doomsday scenario is transformed into an oasis of life, then this can give us hope. Hope that there are options for feasible actions and that we have scope for creative design within the framework of the Anthropocene age. The DBU, National Heritage, makes a safe operating space, see and feel. And for us, as DBU, it offers opportunities for new narratives and storytelling approaches. You see that we can make a great wheel turn, not only in the direction of the bad, but also in the direction of the positive development. We have the tiller in our hands. How can the planetary boundaries concept become a guiding principle for many? How can we take it into economy and society and put it into action? I think some things are very important. Communication, education, cooperation. That's, in my opinion, the keywords. For me, this conference can be the starting point for ongoing processes to make the concept of planetary boundaries come to life. The DBU will make its contribution to this process. For example, we are planning a project together with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the Stockholm Resilience Center. And with this project, we intended to develop, test, and distribute new approaches and methods to put the planetary boundaries concept into practice for economic sphere, mainly for mid-sized business and industry. Ladies and gentlemen, in the spirit of the Kantian Enlightenment, the DBU has adopted the motto, Sapere aude, dare to think for yourself. The project we have introduced and also this conference are a living expression of that philosophy. Let us begin.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for a very inspiring start to day 2 of our conference. We need a new age of enlightenment, ladies and gentlemen. I like this way you described it, that we're leading a double life. We know what we want to do, but we can't actually do it. So how do we get there? You said very much, a couple of the points from yesterday, the new narrative, the new storytelling, this emphasis you put on social justice. So we need to shape not just a safe space, but a safe and just space, as was also said. This is the starting point for making the concept come to life. We really will try by the end of this morning to identify a roadmap for the way forward. But let's move to our next speaker this morning. Thank you very much again for a great start to the day. Walter Kahlenborn, co-founder and managing director of adelphi, Planetary Boundaries for Environmental Communication Opportunities. Walter, over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jackie. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to talk to you today. We already have spoken about the importance of communication regarding the planetary boundary concept. We've spoken about it yesterday. Mr. Bottermann has stressed it just now. I want to follow up on that. Looks like... No, it works, fortunately. 1 world, 9 boundaries, 4 have been transgressed. Human well-being is in peril. What a mighty message. A message everybody should know about. A message which should have a major impact. If you look at the planetary boundary concept, you might think it's an easy task to spread that message. Environmental communication science tells us what is important, what are success factors in getting a story across. An easy-to-grasp message, and I think it is an easy-to-grasp message. Universal appeal, what could be more universal than talking about the Earth? Metaphorical and visual nature, the Earth in front of us. And a concept grounded in science with trustworthy messengers. Now, numerous scientists have worked on the planetary boundary concept. So all that is fulfilled, the preconditions for a successful communication story. And yet, 8 years into the concept, few people beyond science know about it. Let's be sincere. As part of a research project, which has been also basis of this conference here, a research project which we have carried out for the Federal Ministry for the Environment and the Federal Environment Agency, we have analyzed a bit the situation regarding communication and the planetary boundary concept. And we have looked into how and where it is used. We have analyzed press databases in Germany, we have analyzed the political discourse, and our findings have been slightly disappointing. Within the mass media, the concept is very reluctantly picked up. You find it only very rarely. And yes, it is increasingly used in the political discourse. But if you look closer at that, it usually just supports other discourses. It's not introducing its own new discourse. So the concept is little used, it's little known. It has been of limited impact, to be sincere. We have a communication gap. What are the reasons for that? Complexity, unclear core message, low localization in space and time. I think those are the most important reasons for it. If you look closer to that, the concept, it is rather complex. Tipping points, teleconnections, Anthropocene, Holocene. It comes with so many messages. Boundaries interact with each other. The stability of the Earth depends on 9 processes. Holocene-like conditions support human societies. It is not that an easy-to-grasp message. Then look at the picture and the core message. Is it really clear? Humankind is in a deep red zone regarding phosphorus and nitrogen. And yet, what do we notice of that? We notice climate change, but what does it mean we are in a deep red zone on nitrogen and phosphorus? And if so, can we reverse that? Can we get back to the pre-existing conditions? And if we can get back also in 10 years, in 20 years, in 100 years? Do we have to care about it right now? And a third problem, as I mentioned, does it really regard the people on the street? Yes, it is a universal concept. It has a universal appeal, but has it an individual appeal? What does it say to the man on the street? What does he have to do with it? So the concept is not that easy, and environmental communication around the planetary boundary concept is far from being easily to be applied. Should we throw it in a garbage bin, in the environmental communication garbage bin? I definitely think no. The planetary boundary concept offers a lot of potentials. It offers a lot of communication functions which we won't find in any other concept. It delivers kind of a reference point, an orientation. That's pretty clear. It provides target values. It's a wake-up call. We just have heard it again. We have 50 years to determine what's going to happen in the next 10,000 years. We have to act now. It legitimizes environmental policy. We don't talk any longer about economic interest, social interest, and environmental aspects on the same footing. We have to recognize if we cross certain environmental boundaries, we are not going to talk any longer about economic interest. So it legitimizes strong action. It provides a common platform for discussion. It's a motivating tool, as we have to act now. It calls us to act. It provides a conceptual frame, and it's a focal point and support for further discussions. But in order to exploit that communication potential, we have to do a lot about it. We have to clarify the meaning. We will be working within that research project which I just named exactly on that item. And I would be glad if everybody of you would support us in doing so. Getting the meaning clear, what it means that we are in a red field. Should we really use red as a signal? Then secondly, what we have to do is get the concept close to the people. Develop clear messages specifically for the various target audiences. We already have worked on that yesterday. We have spoken about SMEs and large companies, workshops on those. We have spoken about education, getting the concept to children and students. We'll talk about it today again. We will have an afternoon dedicated to the financial service providers. We have to specify the message to those target audiences. And when it gets to the broad public, then we have to develop narratives. Narratives for the various planetary boundaries. Yes, it is an intellectual concept. It is a very complex concept. But at the final end, to get it across, we have to deliver a message which goes to the heart of the people. So use also appealing photographs. And then focus on stability as the main message, especially if you talk to the broad public. In a world which is increasingly characterized by dynamic changes in technical and social and political ruptures, stability is of utmost importance. Emphasize the safe operating space. Nature has created a human-friendly environment. That is the biggest asset to our well-being. It guarantees our livelihood and safety. And final point, which I want to make, there is no message without messenger. If not you, who else is going to spread the word? So I turn over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and very clear, and thank you for your frankness about that communications gap. We need to be honest about where the limitations are. No message without messengers. When we talk about global alliances later on, I hope we will talk about how to mobilize and galvanize those messengers as much as how to work together on implementation of it. We need to win hearts as well as minds. Yesterday we talked a lot about the complexities, and you've both addressed that already, and the simplification, but this appeal to the emotions, which I think came through also from Hanna when she talked about the images and the arts. We'll come back on all those things, but thank you so much for that, and we look forward to hearing the results of this fascinating project that you're working on, and thank you for this event as well, for your role in that. Education. We've talked about communications more broadly and going out and getting to the people, but that crucial role of education, which was underlined yesterday by some of our plenary speakers as the key priority. Going to focus on that now and learning in the Anthropocene. And I'm delighted to welcome to talk about that Professor Dr. Kai Niebert from the Anthropocene Learning Lab at the University of Zurich. Kai, very warm welcome, and over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you and good morning. No, great. To wake you up in the morning, I'd like to start with some inconvenient news this morning. Because the question, why should we educate people, why should we teach them about the Anthropocene, about the planetary boundaries, is not a simple one. Because if we want to have the students, the lay people out there to have more positive attitudes, more environmental friendly attitudes, then we have to put some water into the wine. Because when we have a closer look at different lifestyles, the traditional lifestyles, there we can see that people have a slightly positive attitude for a very good environment, but and they have a very low, the red bar is the resource consumption, they have a very low resource consumption. But it becomes a bit more complicated if we have a closer look at ourselves, I would call us the more creative, critical people with the creative lifestyles, the green lifestyles. We have very pro-environmental attitudes, but the problem with that is that our footprint is very big. We have very high resource consumption. We are the ones who are often sitting in planes, who are doing far travels. And if we want to have the people with low consumption, with small footprints, then we have to have a look at completely another group, the group with low incomes. They have very low positive attitudes for the environment, but a very low footprint too. So the correlation between attitude and resource consumption is there is nearly no correlation, or often a negative correlation. And another finding we have put a lot of money during the last years into eco-school and sustainable school programs. And what we can see there, we have some meta-analysis during the last years. What we can see is that they might have a small impact on students' knowledge about environmental aspects, but they do not affect their pro-environmental behavior or the attitudes at all, at least not on the long run. So perhaps we are looking on the wrong level, because the problem here is that when we have a look at the program level, we only affect 5% of students' performance. So we have dumped a lot of money in this programs, and if you really want to have an effect on students' performance, on their thinking, then you have to have a look at the teachers, and you have to have a look at the students, at the lay people themselves. So I'd like to invite you during this talk to have a closer look at the people themselves. And that's where it becomes a bit more complicated, as it seems at the beginning. You all know these graphs here. We have talked about them yesterday over and over. And I'd like you to focus on the graph on the left upper side, the carbon dioxide graph. That's the issue we have debated in Paris, and the question of how to limit global warming to 2 degrees or perhaps even 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is where I want to make a small experiment with you. To limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, the climate scientists in the audience will correct me, but we will have to limit the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere at approximately 420 ppm. So I'd like you to discuss with your neighbor now what has to happen to really do this. If you would be the world leader and you should limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, you know that we have emissions of carbon dioxide, but it's also captured in the oceans and in the vegetation. How should the two graphs develop until 2100 so that you can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? Turn to your neighbor and take a minute.
He's making you work there. You thought you were just going to listen.
The first of you already seem to have answers. Jackie, if they steal my minutes, you can give me more?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Kai's worried about his minutes now, so clearly you started something there.
Yeah, of course. It's good to see people talk after listening yesterday the whole day and today in the morning. So any ideas? What should we do? What should we do to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees? there in the back.
Hang on.
Give a price, yeah, that's a political solution behind it, but how should the graphs develop? How's about emissions and how's about the capture of carbon dioxide? Here in front.
Where's one? Hang on, we have one here in the front. Jacqueline?
I think opening the Beck's box, as it's known, is not going to solve it. Biomass cannot solve our problem. It's going to have to be a mindset change. Sorry.
Thank you. There was one here down in the middle. You're making me work, Kai. Hang on a minute.
Sorry for that.
No, this is good. It's good. Didn't have a workout this morning. I get it now instead. Please.
I already cycled here.
We will put a tax on everything, but before we do that, we'll put a basic, kind of like a basic level where everyone should have access to certain, basic services and so on. And above that basic, then you pay for the extras.
Thank you very much.
So you all of you have already ideas of how to deal with it politically. I discussed this task with a lot of students, and not only students, but with faculty members, and last summer I was invited as Chancellor Merkel, and we discussed about that too, and I don't give an answer of how she answered it. But most students give answers like that. We have to stabilize the emissions, and we have to increase the capture and stabilize it also. Other students give answers like that. We have to decrease the emissions at maximum and increase the capture. The problem is that the first solution isn't a solution because it will enhance climate change maximally, because as long as you have more emissions than capture, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will rise. And this will lead us directly into the next ice age, because someone we won't have any carbon dioxide in the atmosphere anymore. So how can we communicate all these graphs? We are basing our whole idea of the planetary boundaries of the Anthropocene upon. How can we bring this closer to the people? What we need is a solution like this. We need to have the capture and the emission on the same level. It can be there, or it can be there, and this is the more probable idea, because we cannot increase the capture so much at all. The problem is 85% of the people out there, and even of the well-educated people out there, do not understand the mechanisms we need to introduce to limit global warming, to really live within the planetary boundaries. And what we have done as educators, we don't only want to stop here to know what people cannot do, but we wanted to have an idea, how can we help them? And what you can do when you want to teach and communicate something, you can do three things. You can denote science concepts, you can simply explain them. You can afford experiences, or you can help people to reflect about their everyday actions. And if you want to do the least relevant thing, the least important things, you can denote conceptions, so just put that away, stop explaining, and better show the people where the solutions are. And this is exactly what we have doing in this case. We have shown the people a bathtub where water flows in and water flows out, and let them play with the bathtub. And we have asked them to really model their ideas. And from an educational background, this was a highly effective intervention, because the people while 24% of the people only were able to answer this task correctly at the beginning, after they have gone through this intervention, 75% were able to solve this. Simply after we afforded an experience and we helped people to reflect about their everyday actions. For an educational intervention, this is amazing, because you barely nowhere find so high effects. And what we have done there, we splitted the groups up a bit, and that was a surprise for me, because when we had a look at the science and the arts and music classes in schools, we had similar but different results. And what surprised me more was when we had a look at the economy classes. I thought that perhaps the wrong people are ruling the land. But it's not only here where we need to reflect about our everyday actions, but it's here too. Half a year ago, I got stuck in a train. I was stuck in Hanover, and I missed my next train. So I stood there for nearly 1 hour at the railway station, and in Germany, we have these big drugstores everywhere. So I went into one of those Rossmanns. And I was bored a bit, so I stood in front of this board with deodorants. And what do you think? How many deodorants are in this board? 80? It's 268 different deodorants. 268 versions of this thing we don't really need if we would keep up with each other for 3 days. The innovation cycle of it lies in 3 months. Every 3 months we have something new like this, and now it keeps us dry. It's promised to keep us dry 96 hours. So I ask you, whom of you hasn't showered for 4 days? So we are forced to buy products we don't really need, and this is because we are living on frames like more is better. More is better is a frame that is deeply rooted in our system, and these are the frames we really need to reflect upon. And this brings me to the last point and to my main take-home message. When we want to communicate the planetary boundaries and teach about the planetary boundaries effectively, we have to start from the end. Yesterday we debated about the question of growth. Can we afford another growing society? Can we afford a growing economy? So we have a lot of people out there debating about a degrowth society. When I go into the political world, I don't need to talk about degrowth, because when I talk to Chancellor Merkel or to Martin Schulz as the other one who could become Chancellor, I see them cold sweat dropping down their back. And it's the same with me, because growth is such positively attituded. I only need to ask my 6-year-old. For him, growth is something really good. But we don't really want a degrowth society. But what we want, and this is my point, we should think from the end. What we want is a grown-up society, because this is the result of growth when we have a look at ourselves. And this is what I want to invite you when you start to think about the planetary boundaries and communicate them. Think from the end and don't from the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kai. Thank you. Thank you. And as I said earlier, all our speakers will be back at the end for some questions. And I gave you a couple more minutes there because we got some audience interaction going. So thank you very much for that. We need not a degrowth, but a grown-up society. It'd be interesting. I'd like to get our other speakers who've talked about communications to react to that as a possible way of bridging that gap that you highlighted, Heinrich, at the beginning of this morning. But let us continue to build our picture before we do that. I'm now delighted to welcome Dr. Matthijs Vakkermaat-Nakel, who is CEO of the Global Footprint Network, to talk about planetary boundaries, footprints, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Coming back to the SDGs, we talked a lot about them yesterday. We come back to them now. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. How wonderful to be part of a community that advocates the significance of living within the means of our planet. You make the case that without adequate natural capital, our dreams will be thwarted. All in here recognize that the human enterprise has outgrown the safe operating space, and more people in the world as well share this realization. What not enough people, I think, do realize is that the Anthropocene is shifting very rapidly how the economic game operates, and that's what I would like to focus on today. What planetary boundaries so beautifully emphasize is that there are key physical, quantitative conditions needed to maintain the integrity of the biosphere. In other words, planetary boundaries are the inverse of the ingredients for a healthy and productive ecosystem which can maintain its integrity. These ingredients enable the productivity of the biosphere, and that's what we call biocapacity. Biocapacity, we would call, is the mother of all resources. It's what ultimately provides everything we use. It's much more limiting than, for example, fossil fuel, where we have too much on the ground already. What's limiting the fossil fuel is how much the biosphere can take up. Also, rare earth is not really limiting because we can dig deeper holes and find rare earth, but that takes energy. And energy, again, is limited by how much we can get without compromising the integrity of the biosphere. Therefore, in the time of the Anthropocene, the big question is, how much nature do we have? How much nature do we use? And how can we measure how much biocapacity or nature we have and how we use? We start from a very simple principle that life is incredibly cooperative. But life is also competitive because the potato that I eat, you all will not be able to eat. So life competes for ecologically productive surfaces. And so we can add up my demand for things that use ecologically productive space. We can add all these areas that compete for space, and that becomes my ecological footprint. We need space for food, for fiber, for waste absorption, for building our infrastructure, and we can add it all up. Now, not every area is born equally. They are of different productivities, so we adjust them like currencies are adjusted. We adjust them to a global average hectare so we can compare hectares across the globe, and we express it in global hectares. And so we can compare nations across the world. We use UN statistics just to kind of use official data sets and can look at every country of the world from 1960 onwards. That's when the United Nations started with their statistics. Here are some examples from Asia. The green line shows how much biocapacity is available per person in each country, and the red line shows how much is being used in each country. And what strikes us possibly is that every country looks very, very differently. We all are in the same global storm, but the boats look very distinct. Let's travel to Latin America and top South America. Very large biocapacity reserves still, declining on a per capita basis because more people share the wonderful continent of South America. We also see that Central America is in a very distinct, much more resource-constrained situation. Again, every country is different. Perhaps an even easier way to look at the world is to say every country, in the end, is like a farm. And we can ask ourselves, how much do these people, these residents of each country, use compared to what their ecosystems can renew? And over my lifetime, I was born 55 years ago, the world has changed quite radically from using about 70% of the planet to now about 1.6-fold what the Earth can renew, meaning what we consume in 1 year, it takes Earth 1.6 years to renew. So how is it possible that countries can run ecological deficits? There are three simple mechanisms. One is we can use the global commons, for example, by emitting CO2 to the atmosphere, but also by fishing in international waters. We can net import, like we Swiss do that by exporting watches and importing oranges and meat. We can also overuse our own ecosystems. And for the world as a whole, only the third possibility is possible because the planet does not trade with other planets yet. Elon Musk is trying to change that, but I think it will take some time until we get more from Mars than we can send to Mars. So what does that mean economically? And that's perhaps the key message I would like to bring across, that indeed in the Anthropocene, the economic game is shifting. And let's start from a very simple distinction. There are some countries like Canada, Congo, or Sweden that do have more biocapacity in their own country, more ecosystem capacity than what it takes to support their consumption. They're in the green part on top, and then the other countries in the red part, they have a deficit, like Switzerland, India, Egypt, Germany as well, that use more than what their countries can regenerate. Now, Switzerland, for example, we use 4 times more than what the Swiss ecosystems can renew. For Egypt, the ratio is 3. Now, you could ask yourself, which country is ecologically more at risk? And we Swiss, we would say the Egyptians, not just because they are the others, but we also think we have higher income, so we can buy the extra resources more easily from elsewhere. So the other axis legitimately could be income, per capita income, that allows us to get resource security through the market. Now I put a vertical line in there as well, which depicts world average income. Why? It's a very simple, as an engineer, very simple insight that people who have less than world average income, on average, will be not able to buy more from the others than the others are able to buy from them. Or vice versa, if we have more than world average income, we can buy more from the others than the others can buy from us. Well, that's what money does. So there are basically these conditions. We can have both, like biocapacity reserve, high income. That makes it easy, obviously. Rich is like being rich is makes it easy. No question. Or the opposite in the red, or then the gray in between. Now, how does the world distribute? Overall, you can see some of the countries here. Switzerland again, high income, ecological deficit. We have Sweden and Canada, or Australia, high income, biocapacity reserves. When we look at the population distribution, 71% of the world population today lives in countries that both have an ecological deficit and lower than world average income. So that's a solid majority. Right? They would win every election, just that there are no global elections. And the distribution is otherwise like this. What is interesting is that it seems, that's not a proof, but just it's interesting to see that with a biocapacity reserve, it seems the likelihood that you have a high income is much better, much higher. What can we learn from this? We are motivated, we want to have a great world where all people can thrive, and we recognize that there are planetary constraints. How do we eradicate poverty? How do you maintain economic success? Most people believe that the best strategy is to increase income. We talk about how many people live under $2 a day, for example. That's the World Bank strategy, for example. Most large institutions would advocate that. But if you think about it, particularly low-income communities, as incomes increase, what do they need primarily? More food, more corrugated roofs, more electricity for refrigeration, for light, etc. All these things require resources. So by just conventional expansion, we will need more resources. The deficit on average will go up. At the same time, if everybody doubles their income, the average income line also doubles. So not everybody can beat the average. That's what we learn in mathematics. So following the red line is like giving the advice to India and say, why don't you just all become Bollywood stars? They seem to be having a great life. Because for every Bollywood star, we need 1 million viewers. It is not a replicable strategy. And so that's the danger of kind of the conventional development path. So what we truly need to succeed is a very different paradigm, which is exactly coming from the planetary boundary, safe operating space idea, that we need resource security, not as a conditionality, but as the driver for economic long-term success. If we want to increase income for everybody, and I believe that's an important goal, it's not possible to achieve without making sure that we have the resources to power that engine. That's the main take-home I wanted to bring. And so in conclusion, very simply, that's what you already knew when he came in, but I think is not sufficiently recognized by development agencies, international development agencies, that poverty eradication and securing our long-term success just inextricably depends on functional, robust natural capital. And in order to make that case, in order to make the right infrastructure investments, in order to make sure we don't build ourselves into traps through kind of more fossil fuel dependent infrastructure, for example, it's absolutely necessary to have robust tools that help us build that bridge between understanding the significance of maintaining and preserving natural capital and what it takes to make effective decisions so we can have a robust economy now and in the future. So I'm so glad to be here, part of your community, the people who recognize the significance of natural capital, and I'm looking forward to working with you to make our dreams come true. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mattis. Thank you. So again, if we need, and we talked earlier about reframing the debate from the degrowth to the grown up, and if we need to reframe and help people to understand it in a different way, how are we going to do that? Something I'd like to come back to in our discussion later on. Two more presentations to go, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask any of our speakers questions. We now move to Professor Dr. Dirk Messner, Director of the German Development Institute, to talk about international cooperation for global sustainable development, stagnation, erosion, and windows of opportunity. Over to you, sir.
Very good. So first of all, thank you very much for having invited me. I'm very happy and proud to be here, as you are very happy and proud to be here. I would like to talk about global cooperation, because I think that all of what we have been discussing until now is linked to the question, which kind of institutions do we actually need to make all these kind of things happen? And as you can see in the title here, I will talk about stagnation, erosion, and growth of international cooperation at the same time. So in parallel, we are observing very different trends. And as you can see also here at the slide, I do have 15 minutes, I do have 9 arguments, so let's get started. Okay, so let's move into the content. The first thing which I wanted to mention, this is the first argument here, is that when we talk about the planetary boundaries, for me the major aspect is that we need to talk about global commons. And to get global commons on the ground, to stabilize global commons, and to get access of many people possible to the global commons, you obviously need institutions. And I am mentioning here the importance of structures and institutions and systems of cultures of global cooperation. And when we talk about the culture and systems of global cooperation, it's more than only a price on carbon. And it's more than only efficiency standards. And it's more than only development cooperation. What is needed is what Catherine talked about a second before. Any system of cooperation needs to be built on cognitive maps. So we need to change our cognitive maps, and we need to understand that humanity, that nation states, and that human beings and individuals are being built, and their wealth is being built on global commons. And this is new for humans as a species, because during the last 200,000 years, the 200,000 years of the existence of Homo sapiens, we did not have any impact which was crucial on the Earth system. Now we need to stabilize the Earth system itself. So it is about a culture of global cooperation, and it is mainly a cultural and a civilizational challenge, shifting mindsets. So my second point is then, let's look from different perspectives on where we stand when it comes to global cooperation, institutions, global governance, and all these kind of things. The first perspective which I'm showing here, you now, is a bit depressing, actually. This is literature from political sciences, well-known colleagues here. You can see I.M. Bremer, one of the heroes of international cooperation literature, and his book is titled Every Nation for Itself, the G0 World. So not so much about global cooperation, actually. Then we do find Charles Kupchan here. He has been a policy advisor to the Clinton administration, to the Obama administration. He has been working on global governance, how to bring global cooperation together, new alliances. The title of his book, 2012, before Trump came in, before Putin came in, and all the other ones, is No One's World. No one's world, not everyone's world, not global commons, no one's world. And then we do have John Mersheimer here. For those in the room who are political scientists, you will know him obviously. He is a neo-realist, and he's arguing that we do have a tragedy of great power politics. And what he is looking at is why China's rise will not be peaceful. And he's not arguing that Chinese are less peaceful people than other people. He's arguing that power shifts, which we are observing currently, will lead definitely from his perspective into conflicts or even war. So very pessimistic, very depressing. Political scientists, I'm a political scientist, can explain you very well why cooperation is so difficult and why it is not working. So I will move you one step further, and we went one step further. Together with different other institutes, I'm heading the German Development Institute, with other institutes we built up a Center for Global Cooperation Research, which is based on the University of Duisburg-Essen, and there we brought together all disciplines actually, asking them what they can tell us about cooperation of human beings. We are interested in the basic drivers of cooperation of human beings. So we are working with evolutionary biologists, we are working with psychologists, with cognitive scientists, any discipline. No? And I will show you that in these disciplines you can find knowledge which is useful to answer the question, can we move and are we moving towards a culture of global cooperation? So let's dive into some of these aspects which we are doing research on. The first question which we have been discussing in this group of very different sciences and very different disciplines has been the very simple question, are we humans good or bad at cooperating? This is a very basic question. And you find three answers to this in the literature. There is one school arguing that we are very bad at cooperating. I will give you some authors here, you will know most of them. Hobbes, Dawkins, Spencer, the international relation theory itself, we are very bad at cooperating. No? So this is the first school. It's not part of our gene pool that we cooperate. But there are other schools also. The second one is arguing that we are very bad at cooperating, but doesn't matter. No? Organization of societies and markets is anyway about self-organization and competition. So let's forget cooperation. No? And here are some authors. You might remember Adam Smith, you might remember Hayek. Some of you might have read Robert Nozick, The Minimal State. I would argue that all of those are underestimating the tragedy of the commons, because competition only and self-organization only, as we know, tends to destroy commons. So this is not an answer to our commons question. And then there is a third school. We do cooperate, obviously, but not always. So here are some of the guys who are arguing into this direction. Elinor Ostrom, political scientist and economist. Michael Tomasello, Martin Nowak, with whom we have been working, or their teams we have been working together in our joint research endeavor here. Michael Tomasello is an evolutionary anthropologist and psychologist. And Martin Nowak is an evolutionary biologist. Martin is one of the heroes in his discipline, arguing that beyond selection and mutation, cooperation might be the third principle of evolution itself. And he tries to show that complex systems can only survive, can only be sustainable in time, being based on cooperation. Mutation is implying diversity. Selection is driven by competition. Both exists, but cooperation is needed to stabilize systems over time. This is Michael Nowak from evolutionary biology. Michael Tomasello, who looks at humans and trying to understand what humans are about, he shows that what makes the human species very, very special is that there is no other species on Earth, probably, capable in cooperating like we are. In a sense, this is contrasting political sciences and the perspective on global cooperation. So the next step has been, under which conditions do we cooperate? No? So we do cooperate, but not always. Under which conditions do we cooperate? So with these different disciplines, we try to bring together what we then called the basic mechanisms of cooperation. Mechanisms which stabilize cooperative behavior. And here we go. We call this the cooperation hexagon. And the interesting thing is that we brought these very different disciplines together from the school of people arguing that we are cooperating, but not always, asking them in your disciplines, in your research, empirically, theoretically, mathematically, which kind of factors do you identify which stabilize cooperation? And here they are. And the interesting thing is that there is a huge convergence on that. We do not have controversies between these different disciplines here. They all converge around these very simple basic mechanisms of cooperation. Look at them. No? Reciprocity, trust, we identities, communication, reputation of people, fairness. Without justice, you do not get cooperation on the ground. And then also enforcement mechanisms, of course. No? So the message here is that if you get these kinds of elements together, the probability that you will be able to organize cooperation will rise. In contexts where these kind of elements are non-existent, or only a few of those, cooperation will be very destable. And our hypothesis is that, and we are doing research on that now, our hypothesis is that these basic mechanisms are right at any scale. So cooperation in small groups, Mr. Bottermann and myself, trying to cooperate, but also in large groups, so societies, international systems. The way these factors are being produced is differently. But these factors themselves are always key for cooperation. So we know the basic mechanisms of cooperation. Our hypothesis is that we also know the basic mechanisms of global cooperation. We need to reflect upon how can we invest at different levels to make these mechanisms work. When I saw these mechanisms emerging in our discussions and in our interdisciplinary work, I applied it to the G20 context. I'm chairing the T20, the Think 20, to accompany the G20 process. So G20, what's happening in the G20? And the most business as usual answer to all these dynamics in the G20 is that we are confronted with power politics, of course. So it's about competition, school too. And therefore it's so difficult to find common ground. And this is obviously the case. So rising powers, declining powers, there are power dynamics going on. But our argument is that power is embedded in social systems, in environments of cooperation or non-cooperation. And if power is embedded in non-cooperation, you do have pure power games. If you are able to embed power structures, which are always there in any group, into cooperative structures, you can shape things towards a common end. So my argument is that the G20 stuff is not only about power. It's not only power, stupid. We have a second layer. We do have an under-provision of these fundamental mechanisms of cooperation. I mean, this is a new group which started to work together only a few years ago. So building trust, reciprocity, reputation, fairness, the reception of fairness is something which we need to invest on. And the question is then how to invest into these kind of mechanisms. And I will give you one example how you do it wrong. I have been working for the Global Knowledge Council of the World Bank for 3 years, global cooperation, investing in development cooperation. So when President Kim came in, he asked our group, our scientific advisory board, how are we producing knowledge within the World Bank, as the World Bank, because the World Bank perceives itself not only as a bank, financial flows, but as a knowledge bank. So the question was, how are we producing knowledge here? And the result of our quick and dirty analysis was that 85% or even more of the knowledge which the bank is creating is being created within the bank. Only 15% of the knowledge is being created in contact with knowledge institutions, universities, think tanks, in countries where the World Bank afterwards is implementing huge transformative structural adjustment programs. And then we wonder that we do run into legitimacy crisis because we have not been asking other people where we do our interventions what they think about the problem structure, etc., etc. So the way we work is very important to invest in these kind of basic mechanisms of global cooperation. Here's my sixth point then. I'm going a step further because, and I'm still in this interdisciplinary context. One reaction to this kind of work is very often, okay, these basic mechanisms of cooperation which you saw, they might be very important for smaller groups. But in larger groups, does this really work? And the interesting answer from evolutionary biology and other sciences is that actually when you look at the evolution of human cooperation, every civilizational shift from small groups to larger groups, from larger groups to the Neolithic revolution in the first smaller villages, then 6,000 years ago, cities, then 150, 250 years ago, nation states, now the global system, every one of these civilizational shifts has been accompanied by a higher density and quality of cooperation, because this is the only way to stabilize complex systems. So then the question is, how can we describe this? How does a culture of cooperation actually emerge? How do we get these basic mechanisms which we saw on the ground? There is one very interesting concept.
You're going to need to speed up a little bit because I know you've got three more key points to make.
I'm coming to the end. And I would show you at the end here. I do have 3 ends, but I'm finishing. So, how does cultures of cooperation emerge? No? And we borrow a concept from evolutionary psychology and again evolutionary anthropology, which is called collective intentionality. We should have a diagram here. Yeah, here's the diagram. And collective intentionality, this concept tries to grasp how a culture of cooperation emerges. And here you see the steps or the elements or the dimensions in which a culture of cooperation emerges. Joint knowledge creation, joint practices and routines, working together creates cooperation itself. No? Joint narratives and perspectives need to emerge. Joint norms and values need to emerge. At the end, any community creates a joint past and a joint future. And based on all of this, then you need rules, institutions, enforcement mechanisms, and norms. No? So this is how collective intentionality is coming together, creating the basis for international cooperation. So the last slide is now about the question, are we moving towards this kind of collective intentionality, which needs to be built up globally now? And here is the answer in this slide, sorry. And this will be the last one, which I show you. Here I do have 3 different dynamics of cooperation and non-cooperation in the international system. I draw this graph after having participated in the Munich Security Conference. No? So the green curve is about a low level of cooperation and what we need to manage the planetary boundaries, the higher level of cooperation at the end of the curve. And then we do have 3 different trends here. The first trend is in the middle, the yellow line. Intergovernmental organizations, the multilateral system, I would say, stagnating. No? Even at risk, the European Union is in an existential crisis, in a very difficult situation. So the multilateral system, stagnation. Then we see this red curve going down. No? Our country first movements and our country first governments around the world, making things more difficult. So this is not only about stagnation, this is about erosion, because people argue and governments argue we do not need more international cooperation. We need more our country first strategies. And then the last curve here, the blue curve, is something which makes me more optimistic. What we can see globally and what we do have data on is that networks across and between our societies, so people and students and cultural movements and cities and scientists, are denser than ever before in human history and growing very fast. No? So this is what we can observe empirically. And now coming back, and this is my last point here, now coming back to this collective intentionality graph, which I showed you before, I would argue that the elements here at the outer ring, at the outer tire, they are being driven and they are being produced in these transnational networks, which are growing so fast. This is the good news. No? And where we are not making progress still is the middle, new rules and new institutions and new mechanisms of enforcement. No? Optimistically, we could argue that the preconditions of global cooperation, they might be produced currently, but we are at a tipping point, because the same mechanisms which drive transnational cooperation on the one hand side are producing on the other hand side these right-wing movements which are neglecting international cooperation, and there is a strong interlinkage between both, which we might discuss on the panel.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Dirk. Thank you. Thank you. And Dirk will not only take questions in a moment along with all these speakers, but he'll be in the next panel after the break, so we will be able to build on and discuss some of those issues. Thank you for an absolutely fascinating presentation. I moderate lots of debates where we talk about cooperation and joined up thinking. It's rare to see such a clear analysis of what actually makes it work. So thank you so much for that, Dirk. Our last speaker in this session, Jacqueline Mcclay, Director of the Science Division at the UN Environmental Programme. Jacqueline, great to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Oh, thank you. Yes, I like that. Round of applause. That's very good. I'm going to do a kind of reality check because, yes, I work in the UN and it seems to be very normative, but, you know, it is about things on the ground. And I know people don't think the UN should be an implementing body as an IGO, but I can tell you from peacekeeping all the way through, there are boots on the ground. What do we see? Well, the headquarters for UN Environment is in Kenya. And if you ever had any doubts that we are towards or getting towards tipping points that could be labeled as planetary boundary critical, you should come to East Africa. We've had the worst drought for the last 3 years, over the past decades, and it has decimated not just people, but also wildlife, water is scarce, and so on. So you see an incredible, what I would say, microcosm of all the discussions that we've had around planetary boundaries. So you see it for real. What is interesting is when you take year on year all the extremes. Take 2016, worst possible year in a way from climate perspectives. You know, it was the hottest year on record. We recorded the hottest place, in other words, Kuwait, 54 degrees. We had heat waves. We had sea level rise over a previous sort of 12 years, going up 15 millimeters. And what we saw in the end was 18 million people displaced, specifically because of the lack of water and the lack of grazing and so forth. So all of that tells you that this is an existential threat. It's there along with, you know, artificial intelligence and antimicrobial resistance and a whole list of other things, but it is absolutely there. And without wanting to scare people, unless we talk about existential threats, we will not move this whole piece along. Because, as is the want of international organizations and multilateralism, it takes a long time to get people around the table to agree to it. And the mere fact that we are not legally or legitimately supposed to describe the world in terms of planetary boundaries within the bounds of the UN is something that we are going to try to change. So in UN Environment this year, we have the Assembly, the Environment Assembly. It's sort of equivalent to the General Assembly, not quite up there, but we don't have to refer to any other body when making actual outcomes. So ministers will turn up, and what they have ahead of them is a very interesting proposition, to create a pollution-free planet. Impossible dream, you might say. But, you know, I'm the guy who's got to sort of deliver the outcome document for the ministers. So what are they going to say? What are they going to sign up to? And obviously it's a long-term proposition. So we want to embed planetary boundaries in the thinking, because there's no point in knocking off each hazardous chemical. Oh, let's do lead this time. Oh, then we'll do mercury. Oh, that took us 50 years. Oh, and then we'll do some of these. Estradiol. Yeah. It's never going to end, because it will just be a list of chemicals that you'll want to address, and it'll just take a very long time. So we need to think of chemicals and pollution and the way that we deal with all of this in a much more integrated way. Because it's clear, climate change will impact the take-up of pollutants in the environment. The amount of fresh water will determine the exposure that humans and wildlife have when it comes to pollutants. So every one of those planetary boundaries has something to say about how pollutants move around the planet, become ingested, and actually in the end have an evidentiary effect on our morbidity, our mortality, premature deaths, and in the end on ecosystems and the food that we eat. So in a kind of roundabout way, and this is probably, I would like this to remain a secret in this room, please. Okay. Are we online? Do not Twitter this, right? Please do not do that. We're going to try and introduce planetary boundaries into the pollution-free planet. Now, it may not appear as the lexicon, and the word might not come out in the ontology. However, it will be there, because very, very carefully, if you notice in the planetary boundaries, we don't really have any guidelines, and we don't really have a good idea about chemicals, because there are so many. So we're trying to piece together a way of measuring a pollution-free planet using exposure, using hazards, using impacts in an integrative way, to really try to understand that it isn't just one chemical, it's going to be the whole cocktail that will affect you. So that's just a highlight. I'm asking for input, I'm asking for ideas, because we don't have that in our research agenda. Yes, we do need a planetary boundaries research agenda, and I hope later on at the end of this conference we'll have something that will tackle that integrative approach, and that we don't all fall back into silos. Because the one thing I've noticed here is the earth scientists are standing on pretty firm ground, or melting, but anyway, on ground. The social scientists are a late entrant, but coming in strong, and the economists are not quite sure yet what the cost of all of this is going to be, and how they're going to find the money, okay? And we know that public funds are never going to pay for all of the things that we need. And that's why I think I go back to it being an existential threat. If you read seriously the science, and if you understand all the complexity, even at a minimal level, you're going to understand that things are not going well on the planet. Here in Europe, you're protected. There's a kind of cozy blanket around you. Believe you me, it really does protect you greatly. But when you step outside of that blanket, it is raw, and it is quite honestly pretty scary. But there is hope at the end of the road. And I want to just connect now to what Dirk talked about cooperation. And I'm going to give it through a very personal lens to kind of end this nice session. So today is my 1-year anniversary of getting married to a Maasai chief. Yeah, I know, shock, right? All relax. Okay. I was the UN chief scientist. Yes, I was, and I married the chief, yes. So it was an interesting combination. So I'm not going to tell you how that happened. There's a TED talk on it, by the way, so you can go watch that. Anyway, I found myself in the Rift Valley. And the Rift Valley, as you know, is the cradle of humankind. I mean, it's where humans and hominids really emerged from. We got up on our back legs and we started to walk. Why? Because the climate changed and we had to go and find dinner. And we had to walk a long way to find dinner, and it was much more energetically efficient to get up and start walking. So with that in the back of your mind, you have to imagine that those tropical rainforests all went, and we ended up with a savanna very much like this. Now, this is after the rains. We had a very spectacular rainstorm, and overnight it sort of went green, but it's all brown again. So, you know, the drought is still heavily there. Now, in this landscape, which is vast, you actually find tremendous wildlife. So that's the view from my mud hut on the left-hand side, beautiful. And here's the view from behind my hut, also beautiful. So what the drought has done is actually driven most of the wildlife out of the Masai Mara Reserve, massive sort of World Heritage place where you see, you know, animals on migration routes being, you know, carved up by crocodiles and lions and everything else. And it really happens. I mean, it's not just in the picture books. So yeah, this literally was behind my house. Anyway, so, but what you see is that as the drought and as the change in this massive ecosystem has really taken root, things really become pretty tough. There isn't enough water. Animals are changing their behaviors. The rains aren't coming, so the wildebeest are moving over the border more, you know, earlier. There are animals that are roaming around, elephants and so on. So it gets quite dangerous for people, but it's also pretty scary for the animals themselves. And the only way that you're going to manage this, if you're living in that environment, is to think very carefully about how it is that you've managed to survive for thousands of years. So enter the Maasai. So on the right-hand side are some young warriors, just come in from the bush, and on the left-hand side are some warriors inside some elders inside the junior elders in the village. Now, the reason I want you to sort of think about this is that I don't want you all to go and think you've got to go and live in a mud hut, but I want to tell you some of the essence of why I think what the Maasai have, and probably many other indigenous peoples, that are the seeds of our survival, the seeds of the opportunity to actually not only withstand some of these planetary changes, but also to thrive. So first and foremost, they have a community. They identify, they have self-identify, self-confidence. They may be poor as anything. I mean, there is no money in these villages. There's nothing. There is zero money. But they survive pretty well. They're like professional athletes. They're on the move all the time. Their diet is kind of like the diet out of the best book possible. Don't eat too much. Meat maybe once a month. Blood every now and again. Milk, and you know, whatever you can scrape together. But the point is that it's a communal approach. It's cooperative. So they have seeds of all the things you need: bravery and courage, community, resilience in the face of extraordinary challenges, and most importantly, they have a sense of egalitarianism. Mm-hmm. Now, you may think that a male-dominated society has no place for women. Actually, you're wrong. What it is that people have roles, but they respect that individuals can kind of move out of those roles and do many other things. So when the chief scientist turned up, you know, oh, we haven't got any water. Oh, and I'm not going to walk 2 kilometers to go and get dirty water. Not a good idea. Let's put a solar pump in and let's get it from the spring in the mountain. What's a solar pump? Okay, right, so you realize that none of them have gone to school, so you have to explain gravity, you have to explain solar, but they sort of get it, and about a day later we're building the solar pump, we're putting in pipes, and we have clean water. Fantastic. Oh, electricity, that would be really good. How does that work? Oh, you have a battery. What's a battery? So explain a battery. All right, got that. Right, move on. So this is kind of very practical training and learning of modern life, but then integrated totally into the village. But the thing I want to leave you with is, in the face of this drought, the cattle are dying in their thousands. And so most of you will know that the Maasai's whole reason for living, their wealth calculation is based on cattle. That's it. They believe that God gave all the cattle to the Maasai and other people have taken them away. That's why they like to catch them or bring them all together. So it would be like saying, your bank account, right? Now, your bank account, I'm sorry, there's a fire and all those notes have just burnt up. Sorry, you wanted compensation? You wanted insurance? No, there isn't any insurance. It's just all burnt up, right? So cattle are dying. There's nobody coming to the rescue. No one's going to kind of put water in the ground to make sure that the cattle have got grass to live on. No, that's not going to happen. So about 6 months later, after I got married, we had a big meeting of all of them, from the Samburu through to Tanzania, everywhere. And we said, okay, our very wealth calculation is not going to work. If this is going to be the future, we're going to have to do something different. So I said, okay, well, in my world, in the science world, we do a big calculation, we'd have a simulator, we'd do everything, and then we work out what the grazing capacity is, and we'd find out how many cows we could have, and how many goats, and how many sheep, and it would take us about 2 years, and then we'd come back with an answer. And I said, so you got any ideas? They said, yep. So they described to each other the land, the grazing, where the water was, and everything else, and then they said, well, go and sleep on it, and then the next morning they came back and said, right, we've got a new wealth calculation. We should aim to have no more than 5 cows each instead of 500 or 1,000. We should have no more than maybe 5 goats because they're really awkward. Lots of sheep because they can be managed. Only 2 wives and 5 children because we want all the children to go to school. That was it. New wealth calculation, organized, agreed, spread across all the tribes. The next day, literally, everyone went back to their villages, and it's what's happening. And the ladies, quite happy really, are going to get education, but what they like is that they also have to manage a household on a massive scale. And so it makes sense. Did they have a part in that calculation? Of course they did. So this is about everybody contributing to a communal, community-based, cooperative approach of sharing, and literally this, for me, are the seeds of resilience, how we're going to face planetary boundaries. And I'll leave you with a picture. The key to it all is they're often busy doing nothing. But they're not doing nothing, they're just thinking.
Thank you very much indeed, Jacqueline, and please do come and take my seat. Can I ask, and happy anniversary to you. Can I ask our other speakers please to come back and join me on the stage? Thank you so much for that. Very inspirational, and just shows, and I would like to try and link perhaps later on what you were saying to what Dirk was saying about cooperation, because you're showing how it really happens on the ground. Okay, we have 10 minutes. Any questions to our panel? I should say that in terms of that we will have Dirk and we will have Heinrich coming back to join us in our next panel when we focus on the global alliances. Does anybody have a question or a comment to what you have heard from our panel? Yes, please. And don't forget, please, to introduce yourself. Thank you, sir.
My name is Winter, Haus der Zukunft, Hamburg. I would like to know, what is the ultimate value you are striving for? Is it life, respect for life, for all life, also for animals, for present life, for future life? Isn't that the center, the word life, and the feeling and the emotion for life? Is this the ultimate goal? I would like to know that.
Thank you very much indeed. Other questions or comments? Yes, hang on. I'm going to take, because we have so little time, I'll take them and then come back for some quick responses. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jose from Munich Business School, and I was curious about this notion of transnational networks and why this is somehow hopeful and positive news, and how these transnational networks offer, more hope.
Thank you very much. Yep, and one here in the front. Somebody who's going to be a panelist in our next session.
I'm Katinka Abbenbroek from WWF, and I have a question to Dirk, but also to the others. Would a mutual risk, like facing what we're now facing, work the same as a mutual enemy, and would we be together in that?
Okay, so does it unite us and bring us together? Okay, let's come back, because very interesting questions. Dirk, a couple were directed at you, so perhaps you could start us off.
Very briefly, the question regarding risk is very important, because historically, if you look into your human history, larger kinds of transformations, and we are talking about a larger kind of transformation here towards sustainability, have been based on conflicts and deep crises. And this time we have to avoid it, because running into tipping points of the Earth system would result into irreversible dynamics. So we need to learn to substitute the conflict driver of transformation by a cooperative and knowledge-driven driver of transformation. This is the huge challenge which I do have in mind. No? And maybe to your question, 3 ideas. No, I would say that I'm talking about human well-being, no? And we need to discuss what we understand by this. Human well-being for all generations to come, time dimension, and a healthy planet. No? These are the 3 things which I'm...
On the transnational networks, can we come back to that in the next session, because we'll have more time to discuss that. Walter, perhaps I could ask you in connection with that question about risk. Is a mutual risk the same as a mutual enemy in terms of bringing us together? Do you think it works? I mean, I'm thinking when Jacqueline tells her story of last night, it was a mutual risk that led them to where they got to. Do you see the 2 things acting in the same way?
Well, actually, I don't see them in the same way, because an enemy always means confrontation. Mutual risk is more about getting us all together. So planetary boundary concept might have a greater chance of getting us to cooperate all together.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I also just ask on this question that you raised, Kai, about, you said when you say the words degrowth, or when somebody says the words degrowth to a politician, it makes them sweat. So you like to talk about grown up. Is part of the issue here that when we're communicating these concepts, we need to frame it in a, I hate to use the word, but acceptable way? Is that really what your point is? That if you talk about it in a way that will make them sweat, they won't do it. So somehow we have to change it.
Of course, the change we need is more than just a reframing. We need to have political concepts that really keep the planetary boundary safe, to really have a decarbonized world and so on. But the problem is that as soon as we start to communicate, then we need to ask ourselves, whom do we want to address when we communicate? Do we want to have all the people out there convinced, the 99% not coming to conferences like this, all the students attending a school not being interested in things like that? Or is it in the end the 700 members of the parliament we need to convince, because they are somehow the decision makers? And when we talk to people being responsible in one or the other field, then I think the perspective and the framing of the debate becomes very important, because in the end we have all the knowledge. We know how to have the Energiewende run in Germany, the energy transition. We know how the agriculture has to change so that we have a long-lasting agriculture and not poisoning our groundwaters. But the perspective and the framing is so important, because as soon as I talk, for example, we had a talk with Martin Schulz a few weeks ago, and the Social Democrat candidate for the chancellorship in Germany. He's not the one talking about decarbonization or the emptying the use of coal. But what you can talk about with him is, how can we invest to have 100% renewable energy? So it's just a shift of the perspective and think from the end. Because that's why I made the point so strong. Often what we are facing, we're facing problem when we see the whole way from now to 2050 having carbon neutral society, then we see all the obstacles lying in front of us when we start to look from today, and we see how the curves are not really decreasing from the carbon dioxide emissions. So we need to think from the end and reframe the debate from the end.
Okay. Just on the communication point, a quick thought from Heinrich and from Matisse and from Jacqueline. There was sort of, Walter talked about easy to grasp. It needs to be easy to grasp. You, though, Heinrich, you talked about we need to be careful not to make complexity too simple. Jacqueline then talked about, I told them what a solar pump was and they worked it out and away they went, which suggests everything is translatable. How do you square that circle when you say don't make complexity too simple, given that simplicity is the way people grasp the concept?
Yes, I think we have to be aware and we have to tell the truth. And it is not simple to change the world and to change the economic system in our country. And the people are defensive, and to change their life is very complicated. And so to say that is riskless, it is not true. And so I think we have to make it safe and to tell the people the truth that there is a big change in their life, and we cannot say, oh, it's easy and you will, we can
So although today we're talking about the opportunities and not just the boundaries, be honest about what has to be done and that it will require some pain along the way. That for you is the key to...
Yes, I think we will have to tell some people what they have to do and what will happen, probably happen, when the system will change. And it will change, and it is a great damage in this point.
Thank you. Matisse, would you agree with that? How do we square that circle?
I think in the end, the limiting factor is not the cognitive capacity of our audiences. People are pretty smart everywhere. But I think it's a question of trust. And the trust develops if they can feel that we have their success at our heart. So I think the relationship that I think Dirk pointed out as well, it's really about developing a common trust and a common vision, as you said, thinking from the end that we all want to have thriving lives for all within the means of our planet. And if they truly can trust you, then we can build together the future we want.
So those key factors for cooperation that you identified, for you, trust would be the most important one of them.
Yes.
And Jacqueline, when you described, you know, we go out, we decide that we'll all have 5 cows each in future, that requires quite a lot of trust, that if I give away 495 of my cows, you're going to give away 495 of yours as well. What can we learn from the Maasai experience about how you get that trust?
Well, it's pretty brutal. If you don't cooperate and share, you're put outside the village, and probably by the night you'll be dead.
Okay, that's one way of doing it. Maybe that's not going to work for our international community. But
I actually, no, for me, there's a misunderstanding, I think, about science and the way that we're putting some of these arguments. Many scientists still think they have a privileged position in decision making. The logic is there, therefore it will be followed, and therefore we'll make the right decision. And that isn't the case anymore. And one thing I've learned over 40 years of working in intergovernmental these processes is that unless you make way for the cognitive understanding of those in the room, you will not get good decision making. So trust is one part of it, but understanding, I mean, adversary, whoever is in the room. And I say that because of the facts and fakes that we had at the very beginning with Barbara Hendricks. This is such a critical moment now, because unless it is possible to, don't come at fakes with facts. It doesn't work, because those tribes that have adopted the fake are just going to become more entrenched.
So come at them with?
Different arguments. Change the argument. Exactly. Come at it from another direction. But there's one tiny behavioral observation I'd like to make, which is that in the world of simplicity, complication, complexity, and chaos, simple, okay, we can fix that. Complicated, get an expert in. Complexity, more people in the room. But we're verging on places of chaos, and what happens then is people retrench into the old things that worked in the past, and they're not going to work now. So we need to come up with a completely new toolkit to deal with.
We are out of time, Dirk, but I think you want to say 30 seconds, because we can come back on this in the next session. Please.
Very briefly, I think regarding this question, a 4-step approach. The first thing is we need to make clear that there is a problem. No? The second thing is that we need to explain, you said, that we can solve the problem. The third issue is then to make clear that this is attractive. No? And the fourth thing is that we also need to think about the difficult impacts of the transformation, because we are asking for accelerating transformation. Many people are already afraid of any kind of transformation. No? The whole counter-transformation of Le Pen, Trump, is about rapid transformation. And we are coming up and arguing that more rapid transformation is needed. No? So we have to reflect on that also.
Okay, I'm really sorry. I'd love to continue this conversation, but we are out of time. It's been a fascinating opening session today. Thank you very much to all. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our speakers very much indeed. And in our next session, ladies and gentlemen, as I say, 2 of our speakers will be back on the panel. The others, I hope, will still be with us. Perhaps if you feel burning points you wanted to make, you could also intervene from the floor in the next session. Going to take a just under 30-minute coffee break, and then we will come back to talk about those networks, those global alliances. Thank you very much. Coffee is served.